I'm Michael Vandenburg, and I'm a professor at Vanderbilt Law School and the author of a recent book called Beyond Politics, The Private Governance Response to Climate Change. And I'm very excited to be here to help moderate a fantastic panel that we have today. The panel is called Private Sector Innovation, Accelerating the Greening of the Grid in Forgotten America. And we have a tremendous panel. But before I introduce the panel, let me just thank the participants from Climate Week NYC and National Clean Energy Week, and thank all the sponsors. But let's go ahead and dig right into our panelists, because that's really the heart of our event today. And let me begin with Governor Phil Bredesen. Welcome, Governor.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Phil Bredesen is chairman and president of Clearloop Corporation and founding chairman of Silicon Ranch Corporation. A successful entrepreneur since the 1980s, Bredesen took his private sector expertise into the public sector as mayor of Nashville, my hometown, and as governor of Tennessee. So we're happy to have you on the panel. Next, we'll have Laura Zapata. Laura is co-founder of Clearloop and co-author of a fascinating white paper that'll be the focus of much of our conversation today. She's a respected executive who applies her strategic communication experience to promoting large-scale change for good, both with Clearloop and with other organizations as well. And welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Next on the panel will be Joey James. Joey, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Joey's a co-author of the white paper. He's also a principal with Downstream Strategies. He's applying multidisciplinary lenses to sustainable development. And he does it with a particular focus on something that we'll talk quite a bit about today, which is reclaiming brownfield coal mine sites and other underutilized lands for renewable energy and other investments. And I have to say that this is the first time I've seen Joey without his West Virginia ball cap on. So I appreciate that, Joey.
Glad to be here.
All right, let's move to Henry Richardson. Welcome, Henry. Henry's a co-author of the white paper, also an environmental impact analyst with WattTime, which is a subsidiary of RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute. He's also a founding member of Climate Trace. Henry helps WattTime's partners and collaborators understand how they can affect the electric grid and achieve the greatest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, a central focus of the discussion. And that leaves us, last but not least here, Professor Zdravka Zankova, who is known to her students and colleagues as Professor Z. So welcome, Professor Z.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Professor Z is an associate professor of sociology in the sociology department at Vanderbilt. And her research and professional work are in the area of environmental policy and regulation, both public and private. Her scholarly interest is in understanding the evolution and the performance of environmental policies, institutions, and management programs. And she's done very interesting work on the relationship between the kinds of private activities we're talking about today and the kind of public activities that ultimately are needed on climate change. So glad to have you on the panel and look forward to this. So what we'll try to do is have an interactive experience here, and we'll go through and have a conversation with each of our panelists, but we also are encouraging the panelists to question one another as well. And we will be taking comments as well, and we'll be trying to answer audience questions as we go through. So if I may, let me just introduce the panel topic by suggesting that based on years of research, it's quite clear that we can achieve more than 1 billion tons a year of carbon emissions reductions from the private sector alone. And what we are seeing more and more is a remarkable amount of activity, ranging from renewable power issues all the way through to divestiture issues and many others. And in the book that we prepared, we call this private governance, because in many ways, private activities are filling gaps in what government would otherwise do. And it occurs to me as we talk about this white paper today and where we are in the development of the private sector response to climate change, that we've really reached a new stage, that in many ways we had 20 years of development where the private sector was looking to do what it could, whether it might be renewable power or disclosing carbon emissions, and really just trying to build out the knowledge as to why this is happening and to take advantage of every opportunity we could. But it does seem to me that in the last several years, we've moved into a new phase. And today's panel is in many ways a great example of that. Companies are now becoming far more sophisticated. Advocacy groups are much more sophisticated. And they're beginning to look not just for whether we can do a favorable step, take a favorable step in the direction of carbon emissions reductions, but instead to begin to focus those efforts on the steps that have the greatest yield, to make sure we avoid greenwashing, and to make sure whatever steps we take don't undermine ultimately the public response. And I think what we'll see today with this white paper and our conversation is another level of sophistication emerging about how we can target private sector actions so that we get the greatest greenhouse gas emissions reductions for the kinds of efforts that we're taking. But to begin the conversation, Governor, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and just ask whether you think innovation is central to the response to climate change. Why do we need innovation? And won't government just do it? And so why don't we just sort of step away from the private sector response?
Well, yeah, this whole issue of addressing climate change is sort of a quintessential government activity. Ultimately, we unfortunately have got this polarized and politicized situation in which it's not happening here in the United States, and the prospects are modest at best in the short term here. And I'm really pleased with the way that the private sector has stepped up to try and address this issue. This is something that the private sector in our country has done before. It's doing right now with COVID. I mean, it's a similarly politicized situation, and the private sector is stepping in and doing things that are not happening in the public sector. I think that, though, that when it comes to private sector action, one of the responsibilities that all of us who care about this have is to make sure that they have the tools to do it with. Private sector companies do not sit there with these vast staffs of people who can invent new ways of doing this. And one of the things we're trying to do with this Clearloop that we've started is to give them some additional tools that they can use to address this issue of climate change. The one in particular having to do with the electrical grid. People think of that in terms of primarily offsetting their own electrical usage. But decarbonizing the grid is something which also is a very effective way of just cutting down greenhouse gas emissions in general. It's more than a quarter of all the emissions in the United States. The technology is there, the economics are there, and we need to be pushing not only to offset electricity, but carbon in general with it. And for that, they need tools.
And do you find in the work that you're doing in the private sector that there are some advantages for the flexibility of the private sector as compared to what you saw as both a mayor and a governor? Why is it that an organization like Clearloop may be able to respond quickly in ways that it might be a little harder if you're a municipal government or a state to respond?
Notice the difference between sort of PT 109 and a large aircraft carrier. I mean, once you get the aircraft carrier on course, there's a lot of things it can do that a small boat can't. But the history of innovation and in our economy has often been that smaller companies that have got that flexibility and have got new ideas and don't have an existing business to defend are the sources of a lot of that innovation. And the hope would be that something like Clearloop can put ideas into the world that ultimately become part of the mainstream of what larger companies are doing and bring this kind of thing to scale. But I'm a huge believer in small business as a great source of innovation. And Microsoft didn't start out as a division of IBM or something. It was a small innovative company, and the same with most of the other great innovations we've had.
And are you seeing movement occur in the private sector from large company commitments, which of course get a lot of attention? We've seen some remarkable movement even this week with new commitments. Are you seeing movement occurring to medium and small sized, and in some cases, minority owned businesses as well? Are you seeing that transition occur from the activity, at least in the public realm, being focused on the very largest companies to it moving more into the medium and small sized businesses?
It absolutely is moving. And there's different motivations. I mean, obviously, for some companies, it's just part of the ethos of what they want to do. a lot of smaller companies that have not really thought about this are getting pressure from the people they're supplying to, particularly in business-to-business kinds of relationships. They want to know what they're going to do about this. And unfortunately, the main tool right now in the field of electrical generation has been these PPAs, power purchase agreements, and that's something which is where it works great. But there's relatively few companies for whom that makes sense. I mean, the big tech companies, Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon and so on, they've used them very effectively. But I saw a report, I guess several weeks ago, that there's probably 100 companies worldwide who are doing these PPAs at the moment. And of course, there's thousands and thousands of companies who would like some tool that would work for them. That's what we're trying to provide.
Right. It seems like a very important niche. On the legal side, one of the things that we're working on is trying to come up with model supply chain contract provisions so that it's easier, if you have made these commitments, to transfer those responsibilities onto your suppliers. And one of the point you made right at the beginning that in our own research we found is tremendously important is the notion that the actions by the private sector might help us expand the pool of people who are interested in dealing with the climate problem itself. And what we found is that solution aversion is a large part of the resistance and the polarization on climate. People are so worried about a big government response that they'll go back and not even believe that the climate problem is a serious one in the first place. I'm curious if you find either on the political side or in your work in the private sector, whether talking about what the private sector is doing helps to bring more people to the table or not.
Well, I mean, any kind of government is kind of inherently is designed to be a conservative and small c kind of function. It's slow to act on some things. I think that normalizing these things by having them widespread in the public sector is probably the essential component at this point to having government then step forward and take some more action. Z is an expert on this, and I'm sure she will talk about it. But the more people who are interested, the more it is. I mean, interestingly, a lot of the private sector action is being driven by employees. There's obviously also things like a reputational and the like. But a lot of companies I've talked with are really looking at this seriously because their employees are demanding it. I spoke to a large law firm in another state, and they told me, well, they weren't interested themselves, but because of the new associates who were coming in, they were willing to take a look at this stuff. That I think the way they put it was 25 years ago, the new associates wanted to know how much they'd make and when could they make partner, and now they're asking questions about sustainability and those things. And that's very healthy and it's driving a lot of activity.
Yeah, I can echo that as a law professor. I wish I could tell you that they weren't as worried about money anymore. I think they still are, but you're absolutely right. It's a generation that cares. And I've had the same interactions with tech executives who have said, as we've looked at all the different drivers for the kind of private sector activity in this area, we've said that employees are a huge piece of the puzzle and very hard to study to understand exactly how that phenomenon is going on. Well, with that setup, let's move on, if we may, to Laura, and let's talk a little bit, and we'll come back, Governor, on a couple of these points as we go through. But Laura, what is the white paper that you've put together with this team, and how does it address some of the concerns about our movement toward getting the greatest results for these kinds of investments and enabling medium and small sized businesses to step up and play a effort? What does the white paper do to address those issues?
Yeah, so this white paper is really just a culmination of a lot of research that folks on this panel have done already, and we just put it together in a way to basically address the two things that you guys were just talking about. Primarily looking at private sector innovation has really helped increase the demand for clean energy in this country. There's been a tremendous growth. Just look at the headlines of the kind of growth that we've seen year over year in renewable energy. It's been over 100% increase. But when we started digging into it, we found that there are some limits to that. And so, of course, as you guys just referenced, there are some limits to the kinds of companies that are able to do some real direct impact work. So for every Google and Facebook and Microsoft, that is signing a PPA. There's thousands of other companies that would like to take a climate action and would like to invest in new clean energy capacity, but are limited for a variety of reasons. And then on the other side of things is that we also started looking into where in the country is this stuff happening really at scale. And so we found that about 85% of solar in the United States is concentrated in 10 states. And so that leaves this forgotten America that we reference in the paper that essentially leaves this middle part of the country without as much uptake. And so what we just did in the paper is basically look at two really straightforward variables. We looked at both the marginal emissions, so basically the dirtiness of the grid, which Henry in WattTime has done a ton of work on emissionality, and we'll speak to that. But essentially just looking at how dirty is the grid and then overlaying that with some of the NRELS data to look at the irradiance, how much sun does that particular place in the country have? And we found that there's great potential across the country to build more solar and really scale decarbonization.
And Laura, just so that our audience can take a look, let's put map 1 up, which is the solarization plus grid emissions levels. And that's an example of what you're talking about. Is that right?
That's right. And I think that when we first approached you about this idea in this panel, it was surprising to know that this hadn't been done before. And I think for us, as we found, and we started going into this world of clean energy and carbon emissions reductions, we found that this is not necessarily the way that the country's mapped out or that the climate action has been thought of because for whatever reason, clean energy and carbon emissions reductions have sort of been divorced from each other. But I think that tying those back together, seeing the electricity grid as a great target for us to decarbonize our economy really makes a lot of sense. And so how can we accelerate that action, particularly in our part of the country? So, Tennessee, and you have a bunch of Tennesseans and somebody from West Virginia on this panel who are really saying, this part of the country deserves a real look at and some investment. I know Henry woke up early from California, but thanks to his research, we've been able to really measure this out and understand where do we get essentially our biggest bang for the buck when we build new clean energy infrastructure in this country.
And if I understand correctly, based on some of the research we've done in the past, southeastern U.S. states would be the 6th or 7th largest country in the world in terms of fossil fuel-based emissions if they were a country. So does the project you have underway here and the maps, does it help us think about where within the country we would locate these kinds of new renewables if what we want to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
That's right. And so what we did with the map essentially, and Joey helped us really flesh this out, but essentially what we're looking at is county by county, how many watts it takes to offset a metric ton of carbon. So the fewer the watts we need to build, the better it is to basically get rid of that same metric ton of carbon. What we're trying to do is showcase that, when you turn on the lights in different parts of the country, it has a different environmental and health impact. And so that, really honing in on, okay, where do we go to have the largest emissions reductions, and sort of, highlighting and sharing this map out with the world, because as much as Clearloop would like to partner with companies to build more solar across the country, we know that it's going to take all of us. And so here's a way to be looking at the country and really looking for other innovators to lean in and build in these parts.
I thought that was something striking about this white paper, which I found fascinating. And as you mentioned, when I first saw it and you told me about your analysis, I couldn't believe it hadn't already been done. And I think that's the nature of this. I one time had a law review article turned down because the student editorial board said if this idea was as brilliant as you say it was, it would have already been published, which is kind of an existential feeling as a professor. But in terms of what you're doing, you easily could have just turned this into a proprietary product, and yet you're releasing it as a public white paper. Does that signal that you're looking, in addition to doing the kind of things you're doing with Clearloop, you're looking to actually help transform the grid more generally? Why release it as a public document?
Yeah, for us, I think it was a question of really what is the end goal for all of us? And I think that the end goal is really, let's expand the number of companies that are able to make this kinds of investment, but also the kinds of geographies that receive this kind of investment. And so, coming from Tennessee, it really will take a whole lot of other people to be able to lean in and help decarbonize our grid. And we need to accelerate this action. This can't just sit around and wait for others to act. We gotta get in ourselves and do it, but also bring some others along and convince them that this part of the country also deserves the kind of investment that we're seeing in places where the regulatory or political climate is different.
So we've talked a lot about the private sector, but if I were a city manager looking to compete for new businesses, if I were a philanthropist looking to fund initiatives in different places, or an advocacy group looking to decide where to strategically position my advocacy, would the document be valuable there as well, or is it more focused on private sector utility?
No, I think that this is for anybody. It's a tool for anybody to use, because in reality, we're just using two publicly available sort of variables to be able to get this. And so WattTime has done the work on emissionality, and they have a great deal of data that measures the dirtiness of the grid, and so does the EPA. And then on NREL side of things, this is just, how much sun is there across the country. So essentially anybody who's looking to see where they fall on the map and what kind of climate action they can take, particularly around the decarbonization of the grid, they can look at this map and really get a good sense. And essentially the entire country looks really good for investment. We are a long ways to go. We have a long ways to go, where the United States only has 2% of its electricity from solar. So there's a ton of work to be done. And so great opportunities all around the country.
Well, that's a remarkable how much opportunity seems to exist just from my own look at the maps. But Joey, turning back to you, one of the points that Laura mentioned was the economic development side of this. And I know that's a big piece of what you focused on. Maybe describe, if you would, your role in developing this map tool, and then help us understand more how it might help if our concern is not just carbon, but is jobs and economic development.
Absolutely. So I guess to answer that question, I need to give a little bit of context into my work and where I'm coming from. So Downstream Strategies, my company, is an environmental and economic development consulting firm, and really our work in the solar sphere is, we work primarily on identifying opportunities in challenging geographies, and then implementing economic development strategies around those specific opportunities. So in my home state or in my home region of Central Appalachia, this work is focused primarily on analyzing and pursuing opportunities for large-scale solar on former mine sites. And so these sites, as you can imagine, are located in areas that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. So in my job, every day, I have to put in a lot of effort, a lot of work thinking about what the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy looks like for these areas, for areas like my own backyard. And number two, and probably most importantly, how the heck do I convince businesses and investors to invest in renewable energy opportunities in a little bit more complicated of an environment and a geography than what they're used to? So I was really, really excited when I got hooked up with Clearloop, because we all knew that the mapping products that we were going to be creating, and the mapping products that are featured in the white paper that we've referenced a couple times, would be highlighting some geographic areas that just haven't seen that level of renewable energy investment, or any investment at all, any renewable energy investment at all.
Joey, while you're talking, maybe we could ask for map number 4 to be placed up on the screen for our viewers. Who this is the map with the opportunity zones on it as well. So maybe you can say a little bit as you go through on how that map relates to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so really what we see is that, this argument of emissionality and the fact that, that less watts installed equals, greater carbon reduction in some of these geographies that could vitally use the economic development related to renewable energy can be an additional arrow in the quiver to attract investment into these areas. So map 4, just using opportunity zones is kind of an example of a place that there's a demonstrated need for economic development and investment in those areas. When we overlay opportunity zones, just as an example, over these areas of high emissionality, you see that they almost directly, correlate with each other, which is really exciting. But it's also, kind of an obvious, connection, because a lot of these areas are reliant or, historically over-reliant on the fossil fuel economy. And that's one of the reasons why the investments in renewable energy that we've seen in other parts of the country have not happened there.
Right. Well, that totally explains the utility of this in many ways. And I think it leads us nicely into trying to understand this concept of emissionality. And Joey, we'll come back to you after we dig into these maps a little bit more. Henry, I'm always resistant to the introduction of new terms. I feel like, and Professor Z, I think sociologists are the best at that. I think every paper has to have a new term, but this one seems to work from my perspective. And what do you mean by emissionality, and how does that reflect the kind of work you did on this white paper?
Absolutely. It's really rooted in the concept of additionality, but instead of new renewables, we're saying where you make that investment has a significant impact. Traditional kind of emissions regulations have treated all kilowatt hours equally, and our kind of key insight here is that it really makes a significant difference where you put those kilowatt hours, those new kilowatt hours. A new investment in California may displace lower emissions resources, but in certain other places, which we're focusing on here, any new investment in renewables displaces significant emissions. And so we're really advocating for adding that to the selection criteria when you think about buying new renewables. And I think Clearloop has done that really well, saying we've identified those sites. And then Joey has done that as well, saying not only do we know where, but we have specific sites that need that reclamation. So putting those all together is a key process.
So you essentially have tied a lot of these pieces together. And what's your instinct on why we're just moving now into this kind of analysis? Are we confronting, in your experience, transmission problems, or what's been the barrier up to now? Or are we simply moving from an early stage when people were simply very happy to be able to cite a project, and now moving to the point where they say, I not only want to cite a project, I want to get the greatest amount of emissions reductions as well?
I definitely think it's a combination of those factors. The market's somewhat maturing, and some of the more sophisticated players are realizing that they want true impact, and they're trying to at least measure their impact or identify opportunities where they can have more impact. And so the more sophisticated players are going out there saying, I'm going to buy a wind farm, a solar farm. How can I eke the most value out of it from an emission standpoint as well as a financial standpoint?
And let's pull up map 3, and maybe just our audience includes remarkably sophisticated consumers and producers of renewable energy. But maybe you could just walk us through, for people who are not familiar with what this map means, what you've done here. This is map 3, the WattTime marginal emissions map, and just tell us a little bit about what this means.
Absolutely. So this map's actually showing the different balancing authorities, which are the entities that control the grid. And when you build a new renewable resource in any of those regions, it displaces the last resource to come on, or the marginal resource. And so we're measuring what the emissions benefit of that for all the different regions in the country are. And you can see there's kind of a concentration in the Midwest and through Appalachia where any investment in renewable energy actually has an outsized emissions benefit. And so we've kind of drilled down and identified those regions.
Good. Well, let's move on, and we're going to come back and address some of the specific questions that have come up along the way. But I want to make sure that we get a chance for Professor Z to give us a sense, based on her research, and she's done extensive work in the social sciences on renewable power. What's your sense of where we stand on renewable power development and how this new tool might influence the direction of the field?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So basically, I'm probably going to reiterate a lot of the points that were already made. And I came to those same points independently by doing research, not having communicated with any of the Clearloop people. But basically, my enthusiasm for Clearloop's tool and for this emissionality approach is grounded in some of the recent findings and insights from my own research into corporate carbon and clean energy commitments. And so what I see based on my findings is that Clearloop offers a conceptually new and readily available tool for carbon offsets that any company can use, precisely at a time when many companies are looking for such tools, are looking for new approaches to pursuing decarbonization and clean energy commitments. So to take a step back and just a few insights from my research that build up to this enthusiasm about Clearloop's tool. So I started looking at corporate carbon and clean energy procurement commitments, and I did that with the requisite dose of skepticism. What are these commitments? What is driving them? Are they going to amount to any tangible impact on grid greening? And so my findings can be roughly categorized into good news and yet to be good news. So the good news is that, in fact, there is a lot of real interest from companies, large and increasingly companies of all sizes, in reducing their carbon footprints, and specifically a growing interest from companies in powering their US facilities and operations with carbon-free energy from renewable sources. And we're increasingly seeing companies who are actively looking to use their energy demand and their market power as a driver for developing and adding new renewable capacity. And if you look in the aggregate and you look at numbers from the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance and Business Renewable Center at the Rocky Mountains Institute, we have some really good news. Corporate renewable buyers have leveraged their market power to add upwards of 20 gigawatts of renewables to the US grid between 2016 and now. And their aim is 60 gigawatts of renewables between 2016 and 2025, which is a notable number because that is the amount of renewable capacity additions we expect to occur as a result of state regulations, of state renewable electricity standards. So this all looks really good, right? But as Laura and the governor and everybody else were saying, if you step back and you disaggregate this picture, you see that a number of companies, in spite of these notable achievements in market-driven renewable capacity additions, market-driven greening of the US grid, we actually see a lot of companies struggling to get access to the renewables they seek. Those are renewables with additionality attributes, renewables that reflect the competitive economics of renewable power. And so precisely as companies are looking for alternatives to power purchase agreements, for alternatives to utility green tariffs in cases where those tariffs are not favorable, Clearloop is offering this new tool that is accessible to any company of any size who's looking to decarbonize a product. And I see it as a tool that also offers important co-benefits like environmental health, air quality co-benefits, because you're not just avoiding carbon emissions, you're also avoiding particulate emissions and NOx emissions that are really harmful to health and have serious environmental justice consequences. And one last thing that I wanted to say is that, in fact, how I know that companies are serious about decarbonization and about looking for new approaches to pursuing their carbon and renewable goals is that in my research, I'm increasingly seeing corporate actors use not just their market leverage and their buyer power, but also use their political leverage and policy influence to argue for public policy and regulatory changes that help green the grid mix, that help improve corporate access to renewables. And so that is sort of a yet to be good news, because this pressure from companies to change public policies and regulations in ways that advance renewables, that's still ongoing, and that will take some time. But meanwhile, we need tools that are ready to deploy, and this is how I see Clearloop's emissionality approach.
That's very, very helpful. I'd like to go back to the governor for a moment, and then I'd like to go to Joey and Henry and Laura together on something. But Governor, you know, Professor Z just put on the table this question that I hear all the time, at least on college campuses, and I see in public discourse, is a concern that what we really have at the macro level is greenwashing, and that a lot of this corporate activity is going to undermine public support for public action. What is your experience and what are your intuitions about the relationship between this very strong move we're seeing all this week with the programs we're participating in today, whether or not they're going to likely build more support for government action, or are they going to drain away some of the public support on the idea that, well, we've solved the problem already? What are you seeing? What are you hearing on that?
Well, look, I mean, there are things going on today in the corporate sector which qualify as greenwashing, but I'm not really being critical of that, because if you're a big company and trying to make these huge changes in carbon reduction, you don't have many tools out there. And you know, people have been trying to do things like buying commodity RECs, which of course do nothing marginal to improve that, but they're trying to do something. So I think one of the obligations that small businesses and academia has, the academy, for example, is to start giving these companies some real tools they can use when they want to start doing things at scale. They can do that, and the power grid is a perfect example of that. The kind of limitations that have been placed on it by that of just offsetting, you know, green power offsets other kinds of power are ridiculous. I mean, it's a quarter of the emissions in the country. It's, you know, the economics are there to do it. There's a lot of social benefits to making investments in this country instead of buying trees in some foreign country. It's a perfect, you know, way in which you can improve the infrastructure in this country, do things in areas of the country that need jobs and investment, and give corporations some real tools to make this happen. The problem is so large and so urgent that I can't, you know, I mean, we ought to do all of those things plus some others. I don't think it's displacing anything. And I really do believe, I mean, from my experience in the political world, that to the extent to which corporations normalize this, that it becomes something that big respected companies are doing as opposed to a few people in an NGO or an academia or something like that, that really helps to move the political process toward stepping in and taking a forward role in this, which is ultimately what's going to have to happen.
Well, I'm not going to take offense to the idea the academia might not matter there. I think your point is exactly right, and I share it 100%. And maybe what we can do, we're going to take some questions from our audience, but first, maybe what we can do is roll up our sleeves a little bit and dig into with Joey and Henry and Laura exactly how one might use this tool that you've developed. And I thought what we might try is to get the different maps up and maybe go through them in sequence. And Laura, I don't know if that's you or Joey or Henry who ought to lead this, but I might start with Joey. If you were recruiting a new renewable power entity, whether it's a large business or someone in the small and medium size who's interested in doing renewable power, but maybe also has made a commitment to economic development and social justice, and you wanted them to come into, let's say, into West Virginia, if we put map 1 up, for our audience, what would that map tell you? How would it enable you to better recruit that business, or how would you use it?
Yeah, so if you look at map 1 and where West Virginia is located, you know, we're not located in the area of what I would say highest emissionality, but we're also not in the area of lowest emissionality. So we're kind of middle of the road. But if we were competing, say, with somebody up in central Pennsylvania, which in my part of West Virginia, north central West Virginia, you know, oftentimes we are competing with central Pennsylvania for different corporate investments. If that corporation, you know, had some sort of a you know, clean energy agreement or something that they had signed, we may have a competitive advantage to have them cite that here in West Virginia over central Pennsylvania. So again, I just see it as an additional arrow in the quiver. It's an arrow with a larger head in the center part of the country. Nevada, Utah, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, but it's still usable here in Central Appalachia.
And would you also try to use map 4? Let's get map 4 up and try to understand that. Would you also be using that again if the company had made a commitment to trying to bring jobs to areas that could particularly use them? How would that integrate with map 1?
Absolutely. As companies, seek to make socially conscious investments, I think that the optics of an investment in renewable energy in a coal dependent economy, you can't get much better than that. According to map 4, and again, just using opportunity zones as an example, that's not the end all be all qualification for an area that has economic need. There's clearly a lot of economic need for the types of investments that these companies are going to be making. And so I think what we would try to appeal to is, okay, let's do it in the most socially conscious way possible. Let's target those investments in areas that can benefit the most from them and where they're going to create the most good.
Yeah,
And
I think that just
go ahead.
to jump in here, I think that if we pull up map 2, you will see where the opportunity is, just giving a sense of how much work we have to do. If you look throughout so it's basically overlaying what the solar electricity capacity is today in each of those states. And so how much solar is being used as a total percentage of electricity in each of those states. And I mean, we have a long way to go. If you look at, places like the Sun Belt, it's interesting to see that the Sun Belt is not, ironically, it's not one of the places that has the highest solar electricity penetration. You look at Tennessee, and it's 0.2% of our electricity is coming from solar. You look at a place like West Virginia, and it's 0%, because I think, Joey, we've talked about how West Virginia today has 60 megawatts, I think, is the total, or maybe it's coming up soon.
Yeah, it's like 6.
6, okay.
Between 6 and 10, yeah.
There you go. So
it doesn't even register.
It doesn't even register in the percentage. And so I think what we're trying to get at is basically that there's a few different factors that you can tackle with this. It's not just, you're building more renewables and you should feel good about that, but it's building more renewables, you're getting more carbon out of the grid, but you're also having a lot of social and economic benefits. And just, there's a big question of equity right now across our country. And this is a way to just really start getting at the heart of that. Is core to what we're doing here is, having more equitable access to clean energy across this country is going to be quintessential if we're going to really tackle these big cultural questions that are hitting our society today. And here's a way to just say there's a great deal of work to be done. We have the technology to do it. We now need some more innovative ways to invest this capital in these particular parts of the country. And it's not sort of trying to pit Kansas versus Tennessee or West Virginia versus others. It's more, there's a great deal of opportunity. We're not even, I think it's only 9 states in the United States that have over 2% of its electricity coming from solar. And our sun thankfully hits across the country pretty evenly, pretty well. So there's quite a bit of opportunity. And I think that's the good news we come with today, but also we gotta roll up our sleeves and get to work, because time is of the essence.
Well, we've gotten some great questions, and Henry, because you didn't get a chance to jump in on the last one, I may start with you with this question, and it is: what are examples of companies that could consider solar to reclaim their carbon footprint? I know you've advised companies on strategies in these areas, and so one of our listeners wants to know, well, what are examples of companies that could consider solar to reclaim the carbon footprint here?
Definitely. We've seen a lot of different entities engaging in this kind of impact-based framework for procuring renewable energy. We've seen quite a few universities. Boston University considered, they had a whole menu of different PPAs in front of them, wind and solar, and they went, we could buy one in Massachusetts. It doesn't have the same impact as one in North Dakota. So they went and just compared the 50 or so projects that came to them and picked out the ones with the most impact. And so we've seen that method is pretty accessible to most corporate entities, especially if you're of the scale that can engage in a PPA. And if you're not quite at that scale, we've actually seen coalitions of buyers come together to actually be large enough to purchase a PPA where everyone's taking 10 megawatts or something out of that. And it really opens up the market to a much broader degree.
Michael, can I just add something to what Henry said? You know, there's been this approach that's been pushed by a lot of the NGOs that somehow every industry has got to totally control its own carbon footprint. And yet the reality is out there that there are some places that it's easy, there's some places that's very hard. And if you're making cement or concrete or steel, there is heat used in process and energy used in process that, you know, there's no practical way to do that. When you look at the electrical grid, you've got very practical economic ways to do it. So I think for a lot of companies who are struggling with how do you actually, at any reasonable economic cost, you know, get as much carbon out of this as we would like, you're going to have to look at some kinds of offsets in other areas. And we need to open our mind to that. That's kind of what we're trying to do. It's not only to replace electricity, it also is a great way to offset carbon.
And Mike, if I may jump in really quickly to contrast this approach to pursuing carbon offsets, which generates tangible carbon reductions as well as economic development, environmental health benefits, to other approaches that companies have pursued. So as the governor was saying, investing in decarbonization by investing in afforestation somewhere in a different country, usually in the global south, could be a good thing, but it is also potentially and actually a problematic thing in many cases because the afforestation that happens in the name of carbon offsets is documented to result in green grabs and in actually displacement of communities and resource-dependent people in some cases. So in some cases, you know, other types of carbon offsets act and are at odds with economic livelihoods and community well-being. And here we're looking at a type of carbon offset that actually has spillover effects that improve economic livelihoods potentially and well-being and environmental health. So I think that is another kind of dimension. If you scale up to like a global map of carbon offsets, that's another important way to think about this tool as a decarbonization strategy and how it measures against alternative approaches to decarbonization.
Right, that makes sense. We got another question, and let's see if we can get any panelists who'd like to jump in on this one. When you say that we can bring others along on solar development using this tool, can you be more specific about who you need to bring in or buy in from? Who else is going to get added into the marketplace, it seems, is the question with the tool we see here.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that what we've been talking about here is sort of just to take a step back. There's sort of been two different approaches to the way that, and one major approach to the way that carbon reductions from the grid happen. And so that's PPAs. PPAs have sort of dominated the way that companies procure clean energy power and therefore build new solar or wind facilities in this country. And so what Clearloop is offering is sort of a slightly different interpretation of that. Instead of having a contract to that's a long-term contract to buy that power, what we're saying is we are doing sort of a carbon offset. So you're paying a fee instead of buying a tree, you are buying capacity. So for every metric ton of carbon that you want to avoid or offset, what we call reclaim, there is an equivalent amount of watts that you can build. So 30 watts, 37 watts, which is what the map represents. And so that capacity will be generating clean energy for the lifetime of that watt. So I know there's a lot of sophisticated people here listening to us, but I'm coming at this from a slightly different background. So I think of it as a light bulb. Of that light bulb will be generating clean energy for its lifetime, and that will be sending clean electrons back into the grid, because we're talking about utility scale. And at the same time, you've been the company has been able to take credit for being the thing that constructed their subsidy. Essentially, was responsible for constructing that brand new facility. It wouldn't exist if it were not for their subsidy or their investment. And then the community in that particular place where we're building gets to benefit from the clean energy. It's sold back into the grid as brown power. So, there's not sort of the double counting for the utility or anybody else. So there's no RECs associated with it. It's essentially just a carbon offset, since that's the environmental attribute instrument, unless a company wants to say, I don't want to do it for the carbon offset. I just want to generate the RECs and take credit for the 40 years that those RECs will be created thanks to my capacity building. And so I think that what we're seeing here is that we're trying to break open that market for companies that are not looking to purchase power primarily. They're looking to just decarbonize. So this is a tool to reduce greenhouse gases. This is a way to build new capacity in the United States that brings the sort of jobs and infrastructure that we're talking about and that kind of investment, but also allows the company to claim very tangible credit for that authentic impact that Henry has referenced before. So for companies, even large companies today that have gone into the PPA world and have already procured, they're already RE100, they've already greened their electricity, and they're looking to do more. They're either looking backwards and taking historic account of their carbon footprint, or they're looking to help their supply chain do something else. This is a way to look at the electricity grid as beyond just greening your own electricity. This is a way to expand the market and look at other ways to offset our carbon footprint and help decarbonize our economy.
Yeah, I'd like to, Mike, if I could, I'd like to emphasize that supply chain that Laura just mentioned. I mean, if you're a Walmart, for example, I mean, they have a number of commitments, and there's things they can do at the corporate level with their stores. But far and away, the largest carbon footprint of that entire activity is all the Scope 3 stuff. It's all that stuff out there in the supply chain. A lot of that is small companies who don't have, chief officers of sustainability or something. They need some tool which they can purchase and use, and they're nowhere near in a position to set up, long-term PPAs and those kinds of things. So I see it as a way of a tool really that you can use to deal with all those, that a company can use to deal with all those Scope 3 emissions. A tool they can put out into their supplier chain and bring a lot more people into it. The other thing that's I think that's really important here is just the auditability of it. If you're looking for carbon offsets and you're doing it by buying forests somewhere, I mean, there's a lot of calculations between that purchase and how much carbon you're claiming. Particularly big public companies that have concerned about reputations are starting to get very careful about what it is, what can they prove about what it is that they are claiming in these regards. And the nice thing about electricity is it's perfectly auditable. I mean, there's a meter, how much power is going into the grid, what the marginal emissions are in those areas. And it's just a much tighter, more scientific way of actually making a claim about what you're actually doing. I think that's going to be more and more important in the future.
I would think that would also make that approach something that NGOs would be more comfortable with, since they can see the transparency of what the commitment might be and do the things that they do to try to enforce those over time. Joey, we're getting a couple of questions as well about things like the other environmental effects of building solar facilities, whether or not communities and opportunity zones should go to a DC microgrids and lots of other related things. How does the mapping tool and the role that Clearloop might play affect the other sets of activities that communities may be engaging in to both get more economic opportunities, but also decarbonize at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I would categorize the mapping tool as just another arrow in the quiver that these communities that are worked on the forefront of economic transition from fossil fuel based economies to cleaner economy can use. Again, it's not the solution for everybody, but I would definitely, I'd say that it's a powerful tool for some, and as is Clearloop.
Right. And let me just ask a question.
I just wanted to
ahead,
jump in and say, one of the things that I think would be really interesting to also hear about is, Henry, your work with Carbon Trace, just, this point about more companies wanting to feel like know that there's a tangible, measurable way to have, sort of emissions and being able to measure their impact and being able to know exactly what they're avoiding. I think, I know WattTime has done a lot of work on that. So thinking that may be a good, just talking about Carbon Trace in general, to understand it a little bit more so that we can see sort of the progression of where carbon emissions reductions are going.
That's an excellent question. We've seen a lot of interest in actual evidence about where emissions are coming from, and so we're using what we call remote sensing, but more familiarly is like satellites, to actually look at the emissions from different sources. So whether that's shipping, we have a coalition of different partners. Whether we have a shipping partner, a transportation partner, we're doing power plants because that's our expertise. And so you can actually look at the actual emissions coming out of the smokestacks via remote sensing. And so that gives when you can see those changes over time. And where in places where you don't have the EPA tracking emissions closely, you can begin to gain insights. You can apply this concept of additionality beyond the United States and begin to say, if I invest in renewables in Vietnam versus Europe, what is the emissions benefits? You can see this concept scaling of targeting investment to where it has the most impact.
That's fascinating. Z, can you imagine, given what you've done in studying global private sector action, that kind of tool might help redirect investment around the world?
Well, imagining these kinds of things is what keeps me going. When the current news is it's sometimes not very promising. So yes, absolutely. And then just to piggyback on one of the previous questions, what I'm seeing in my research, both on US-based initiatives and global initiatives for carbon offsets, is that companies are increasingly partnering with NGOs to figure out ways of how to meet these goals and commitments that a number of companies have set for themselves. So I see this kind of tool as something that also enables and facilitates corporate NGO partnerships towards decarbonization and expanding the application of this approach beyond perhaps just the US, for sure.
Well, Governor, we're getting close to the end of our time, but one of the things you've done throughout your career, both as a mayor and as governor, and then in founding Silicon Ranch and now Clearloop, is you've looked over the horizon 5 or 10 years and seen trends that some other people haven't seen. I'm curious about your thoughts about how this mapping exercise in the white paper, Clearloop, and others are going to help communities potentially look over the horizon and what you see coming up next. Where are the greatest opportunities? Is it that movement from major companies making commitments toward the middle and smaller sized companies, or where are things headed in the future, as hard as that is to do?
I think this is just a natural next step. I mean, I believe in this, and when you think about things and invent things, this concept is sort of stepwise refinement. I mean, you get the big idea out there, and then you start working with experience to refine it further and further. I think that's what's happening now. I mean, we started out with the notion of, RECs are good. We should try to offset electricity, and then you come to an understanding, well, they're not all the same, I think you also come to an understanding that there's a lot of smaller companies and people out there who want to play in this world, and they don't have good tools to do it. So what I see happening here really is just what happens, when inventive people tackle a thing, which is you start with a big concept, you make it better. It'll be better 5 years from now than it is today, and continue to improve it. But that's the way our economy works, and I think it's working here. There's some great NGOs, there's some great people out there working on things. We're just saying, okay, what's the next step in this? How do we tighten it down? How do we make it available to more people? That's what this is about.
Well, thank you. I think with that, that will be our last word here. We've had a wonderful discussion, and I think this is a fascinating new tool, new concepts. I love seeing the kind of effort that everyone on this panel is engaged in, helping us just get over the horizon, as you mentioned. And I think it's been a wonderful contribution by each of you. Thank you so much. And with that, we will we'll sign off. Thank you, Joe, Governor Bredesen, Henry, Laura, Z. And thanks to all the support from the staff and the various different funders and supporters of this group. It's been a really great team exercise. Appreciate everyone's efforts here.
Thank you.